I have a question. What is it that we meant just a few minutes ago when we sang together, I put my faith in Jesus? What is it that you meant when you sang that? So often we sing these songs and we say these words and they just kind of roll out of our mouth. But what do we say, or what do we mean when we say, I put my faith in Jesus and Christ is my firm foundation, the rock on which I stand? Or is it just another lyric? We've been going through the book of James together, a book of James that kind of, thumps us on the nose a little bit with its clarity about what the author is asking us to do to live like Jesus. I've been teaching a class on Wednesday nights, and my subtitle is The Book of James, a letter to Christians who could do better. And I think that was true then, and it's probably true now as well. James was written to not one specific church, but lots of churches that were scattered all over Asia Minor. So there wasn't a particular situation that James was addressing, more just the life of faith itself when, life comes at you. And so we've been in chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and today we're going to pick up in chapter 4. And James says this: what is the source of conflict among you? What is the source of your disputes? Don't they come from your cravings that are at war in your own lives? Don't they come from your cravings that are at war in your own lives? Then later on in verse 10, he goes on to say, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. Brothers and sisters, don't say evil things about each other. Whoever insults or criticizes a brother or sister insults and criticizes the law. If you find fault with the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge over it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, and he is able to save and to destroy. But you who judge your neighbor, who are you? You don't really know about tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for only a short while before it vanishes. Well, if someone telling us that we are just a mist that appears only for a short while before it vanishes, I don't know what else will humble you, if not that. As Gan prayed just a moment ago, so often when we get in these rote ways of being, we sing lyrics, we say little sayings that we've grown up hearing that just kind of become something that we parrot. We begin to think that we are the God of our own lives and that the universe revolves around us. We look around at the world in which we live and the lives that we create, right? John Carl and I sometimes look at each other and we're like, I'm so proud of the life we've created, as if any of that is our own doing. And we become a sort of God unto ourselves. And James is inviting that church in the first century and us in the 21st century, to take a step back and humble ourselves. And to remember that God is God, not us. No matter how talented God made us, no matter how smart, no matter how funny, no matter how successful we are, that it's God. And Christ is our firm foundation, not our reputation, not our business, not our career, not any of that. I've always tried to have some mentors in my life, because turns out most of the time I don't know what I'm doing. It's a very much fake it till you make it attitude over here. And I have a memory of when I first got to Canterbury. I was kind of being a little overwhelmed and not really sure what that would look like or how it would play out. And y'all know we have a lot of like successful people in our church, right? Like lots of business owners, CEOs, that kind of thing. And so I went to talk to one of these CEOs who had had a very successful career. And of course, made time for me. You would think I would have to wait like 3-4 weeks to get on the calendar, but sent an email, and later that week, I was in this person's office. And the way that that person used that hour plus, right, to just listen and pour into me and to pretend like I was the only thing on the calendar that day has stuck with me in the way that we should treat people. Contrast that to some family friends we have, also a CEO. I remember we were at lunch at the Montgomery Country Club years ago. And the whole time that we were talking, his eyes were darting around behind our heads, to see who else was in the dining room, to see who walked in. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? Because, we all have certain impressions we have to make, myself included. And I can tell you, I really didn't feel like we were even at the same table for that whole hour and a half. Both go to church most Sundays, both Christians, both, all that, but two very different experiences. Without saying a word, I could tell the difference in the foundations. One wasn't very showy. One, was very normal. The other, very concerned with the appearances, with what was going on in the dining room, even looked to his son and said, y'all know the Montgomery Country Club has a room that only men can go in, or at least 10 years ago did. And looked at his son and said, hey, so-and-so and so-and-so is in there. Before we leave, you got to make sure you go talk to him. Well, there's nothing wrong with networking, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. The foundation and the intention and the reason behind each of these two people and what they were doing was vastly different. One, on the outside, may have looked more successful, may have looked more put together, may have, fill in the blanks. But I can tell you it was pretty shaky, right? This one, the foundation was much more steady, much more level, much more Christ-like, maybe, much more humble. There is something that humility and a life of faith have that is intertwined. This thing that happens when we grow more Christ-like, that we realize that we aren't the center of the universe, that what we have, what we do, who we are in relationship isn't what matters most, but the life we are building on Christ is what matters most. Jesus had some things to say about that. And we sang about it a little bit earlier. Remember at the beginning of this series, I told you that James based all of his book on the Sermon on the Mount, that sermon that comes in the first 5th through 7th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, and on Proverbs. So it was everything that Jesus said in his first public sermon and all of the wisdom sayings of the Old Testament. And the Sermon on the Mount ends like this. These are the very last words. The rain fell, the floods came, and the wind blew and beat against that house. It didn't fall because it was set on the bedrock. But everybody who hears the words of mine and doesn't put them into practice will be like a fool who built his house on sand. So in this story, Jesus is using a parable of two builders, one who builds quickly and builds his house on sand, and one who builds his house on rock. And, life happens and things come, and one perishes and the other kind of stands firm. We just sang it in a different way. So that begs us to ask, what are you building your life on? If our lives, as James put it, are a mist, what are you building your life on? Something steady that'll last? Something that's pretty tall and lots of people can see it, but not a whole lot there. Part of how we build our lives is based on the way that we see the world and the stories and the messages that we grew up with. I'm looking around, and lots of you are successful people, and most of us have probably read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey. It doesn't age. It's much like the things we read in the Bible. We just forget the wisdom that's behind it. But Stephen Covey talks a lot about paradigms. Paradigms being the models or the theories, perceptions, assumptions, or frame of references that shape how we see and interpret reality or the world every single day. And so we all operate based on our own paradigms. So think about that. Even though we are all gathered here as people who are seeking to worship Jesus and live lives modeled after him, we all have a way of seeing or being in the world that cause us to do that differently. And so we all operate based on our own maps of how we see things and how things should be, which are shaped by our backgrounds and our experiences. So sometimes, because of the way that we're shaped or our backgrounds or our experiences, it's easy to place some things that are good and that we think are good over the good. So Covey emphasizes that we often project our own views onto the world and mistake them as objective reality. You ever wonder why we judge each other and why we're mean to each other and why we fight? Remember the beginning of the scripture when James is talking about why do you judge each other? There's only one judge. Well, we're all bringing our own paradigms and we're all bringing our own experiences and backgrounds and ideas of what's right. And objectively, we think that what we think is right is objectively right. We're putting it all over everybody else. Remember, because we're the God of the universe in our own worlds. And so he goes on to say, in order to be effective, and I would say in order to be more like Jesus, we have to have a paradigm shift. We have to recognize that we see the world a certain way, and so we have to shift and change how we see and change how we see our place in the world. Oh, okay, so maybe I can see that Gan has grown up completely differently than I am or have. And his way of seeing the world is still just as valid as mine. Maybe that will help me realize that, oh, maybe I am not the center of the universe and God of my own life. But the Creator who created all things did. And so this paradigm shift is a change from the inside out. It requires us to be honest about who we are and how we are in the world so that we can see deep-seated change in our mind, in our hearts, and then ultimately what we do with our hands and our time. And so a paradigm shift, according to Covey, is more than just changing your attitude or behavior. It's being honest and addressing the root cause of our actions and why we do the things that we do. So why was it important to look past John Carl and I's head at whoever walked in the door? Why was it important to have a member of our party get up mid-meal and go to a room that half of the table could not enter? Why was it important? Why was it important? Why was it important? The paradigm shift would be, hey, for an hour, this table is all that mattered. And the person in front of me is the most important person in the room. Not because of what they can do for me or what it makes me look like in a room full of movers and shakers, but because of who they are. Created in the image of God. It's a paradigm shift. Jesus actually, I would say, was one of the original shifters of paradigms. All throughout the Gospels, he starts his parables or his teachings like this. You have heard it said, but I say to you, right? You have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, if someone harms you, turn the other cheek. That is a paradigm shift. That is a way of seeing the world and your place in the world and how you behave in the world differently. And the only way to go about that, James tells us, is through humility. Humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. Humility is not something we talk a lot about in culture today because it's not something that, last I checked on, if you were given a list of efficiencies that your job wants you to do, humility normally isn't very high. Charisma, sure. Leadership, great. Integrity, maybe. Humility, rarely. So that in and of itself is a paradigm shift. Jesus taught us with Jesus' own life how to shift our way of being, thinking, and behaving in the world. This is what Philippians says. Don't do anything for selfish purposes, but with humility, think of others as better than yourselves. Instead of each person watching out for their own good, watch out what is better for others. And skips on. Though he was in the form of God, talking about Jesus, he did not consider being equal with God something to exploit. But he emptied himself by taking the form of a slave and becoming like human beings. When he found himself in the form of a human being, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even on a cross. When Jesus was alive and walking and teaching, he used his words to help people shift their paradigms, their mindset, their way of seeing and being in the world. But what he did was not just use his words. Just like James, he believed that words without action are dead. And so with his very life, he showed us what it was to be humble, to change the paradigm, to live a life in love, to live a life in service to others, to live a life where the whole was more important than the individual, where we're turning people to community and giving people a place of belonging and speaking deliverance and healing into every aspect of the world that he touched was the most important thing, even if that meant it led to death. Now we know on this side of history that death did not end in death, but ended in resurrection. But guys, that is a paradigm shift. And so my question is, this is what I want to leave you with, and then I want to leave you with a question. When we change the way that we look at things, the things we look at change. When we become humble, when we realize we are not the center of the universe, when we are not the God of our own lives, then suddenly the way that we look at other people and the way that we look at the world is different because things have shifted. It's not so much that we look at people as objects or things in our way or people who could do better, but as people just trying to do the best they can to live lives after God. And so my question for you this morning as the band comes back out and we sing one last song together and you go into the rest of your week is, what are the paradigms, what are the stories, what are the beliefs that you have been given, that your experiences have wired in you? And what are the paradigms that need to change, that need to shift, so that we together can be more humble, so that we together can live more like Jesus, so that we together can do the work that Jesus called us to do and not just speak Jesus with our mouths and not just sing lyrics that we don't really put meaning behind, but that we live lives as if Jesus really is our firm foundation. And everything else gets built on top of that. And the tower may not be as showy, but I can guarantee you it'll have more strength. Amen.